Hear now the word of the true and living God. 1 Samuel 17, verses 41 to 49. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David, and his shield-bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. This is the word of the Lord. Please be seated.
Good morning. When we were standing up there just before Sebastian started reading, Zach leaned over to me. That's Zach. He just left. That's Zach. Leaned over to me, and he goes, "Sorry, I killed the mood." And I thought, well, nothing gets me pumped to read the creed like remembering the Spanish Inquisition. But what a wonderful thing to remember. That throughout this sometimes sordid history of Christianity, we arrive at this present Sunday, still gathered together, still to remember such good news. I've been pastor here for a short while now, and so I've gotten to know a lot of you pretty well. Some of you half as well as I should like, and others half as, I don't remember what the line is. And you people are screwed up. And, same. And the unique thing about Christianity is we get to say, when it's like, look, don't you not believe in Christianity? Look at the history of your faith. Look at who you are. Look at, the people that you know, that you socialize with, and you call each other Christians. You call yourselves Christians. And with Christianity, unique among religions, we get to say, yeah, see, this proves our doctrine. This proves that the need that we say Christ meets is more real than we could ever imagine. It's something that even those of us that desire so deeply to overcome it, seems that the best we can do is when we become Christians, we just get into the war against it. And we look forward to the hope that one day the victory that Jesus secured on the cross will manifest in a kingdom that has no end. And that's what we say to conclude our creed. So, I just thought of that when, that's called improv preaching, when Zach leaned over and said that to me. And I found it really encouraging. So I hope you are too. All right, you ready for announcements? Best time of the week. Easter is April 21st this year because the moon shifts into Jupiter or something. I don't know why Easter is when it is. I'm sure there's a reason. But Easter is on April 21st this year. And on Easter this year, we are doing baptisms. So if you would like to be baptized, if you are a Christian and you haven't been baptized yet, then be baptized. Jesus says to, which is good enough reason. And it's a declaration to us of the new life that has taken place in you because of Christ. So be baptized. You can sign up for that if you go into the app. If you don't have the app, go to your app store of choice, type in Redemption Church Denver and download it, and then go to the calendar on the app, and you can tap baptism for Easter 21st, and there's a sign-up form in that calendar event. So if you would like to be baptized, please sign up there. Next, you can still join a redemption group here at Redemption Church Denver. There are 2 ways to be involved. We gather. And our small group gatherings take place throughout the week. Our large group gatherings you're at right now, so good work. But if you would like to be involved in a small group gathering, you can sign up for that as well in the app. Also, April 7th, this one probably could have been an email. If you're a redemption group leader, we're having a lunch after church to follow up on how redemption groups are going. So April 7th, if you're a redemption group leader, all 6 of you are like, thanks. And the rest of you are like, could have been an email. All right. Close to 20 plus, says Krista says. So yeah, this was appropriate. All right, let's pray. Father, today we're going to look at a story that is so familiar, David and Goliath. I pray that you would give us new eyes to see this old story. Lord, that we might be encouraged by it in ways that we haven't been before. That your Spirit would come and apply it to our hearts, that by it we might be changed and we might be encouraged as it has encouraged people for thousands of years. That we might join in that stream by your Spirit. Lord, we lift this up in Jesus' name. Amen. So, David and Goliath. Our only reading of the year where the last phrase is, and the stone went into his forehead and he fell to the ground. It's an epic story, and it's a familiar story. David and Goliath, let's remember, this is not a story if Goliath wins. If Goliath wins, we have nothing to talk about. You know, if LeBron James and Dwayne Wade joined the Miami Heat and they win back-to-back national championships, it's not a story. When Goliath wins, it's just, normal. This is the way life is. This is the paradigm that we expect all things to function in. There's power and there's weakness. And power always trumps weakness. That's the way the world works. And if David happened to be like 9 foot tall and had armor twice as thick as Goliath, we wouldn't talk about this story. It matters because David is a kid, not even old enough to be a part of the army. And Goliath is a seasoned veteran, a champion among champions. And David wins. What this story exposes to us is that this normal way that we view the world, this story is true. It means that the normal way we view the world in terms of power and weakness, and there's winners and there's losers, and you can bet on them beforehand, and we know what amounts to what. If this story is true, it means that that normal way of viewing the world, it might not be right. We may actually be assessing and seeing all of our experiences wrongly. And so that means there's another way to view the world. And that's what we're going to look at today. There's another paradigm outside the paradigm of power. And look, we're obsessed with the paradigm of power. Our culture, we have a more advanced paradigm of power than perhaps any other culture in all of history. We even gave our paradigm of power an origin story. Our culture would say we all sit here today as the intelligent organisms that we are because we conquered the weaker ones. And so power rules and makes decisions through death over history. And of course, that's the normal workings of the world. But if this story is true, it means there's another paradigm out there. That maybe the baseline of existence is not just power. Maybe it's something else. C.S. Lewis says that we overlooked this other baseline of existence. We overlooked it, and we overlook it so consistently, not because it's too grim, what this other reality is. We overlook it because it's too glad. This other paradigm, which we'll see demonstrated in David, this paradigm of faith, we overlook it because it's too joyful of a possibility. So let's look and we'll see what that is. So the story is really familiar, right? I'd love to just walk through it line by line, but it's actually a really long chapter. Chapter 17 of 1 Samuel is a pretty long one. So instead of just walking through it line by line, I'm just going to set the scene, and we're going to look at a couple of things as our main points for the morning. We're going to look at David's journey to fighting Goliath, and then the battle with Goliath itself. And in that, we're going to see the paradigm of faith and the paradigm of power working it out over and against each other. We're going to learn how to adopt that paradigm of faith. So here's the setup. The Philistines and the Israelites are at opposing ends of the valley of Elah, each on a mountainside. And the Philistines put forward their champion. His name's Goliath of Gath. Gath is one of the 5 cities of the Philistines. And Gath comes forward, stepping out from the Philistines, and he taunts the Israelites. And when he taunts them, he proposes this challenge. And I think this is actually kind of a step up in warfare for the time, where he says, look, you send one person of yours to fight me. And if I kill your guy, then your whole nation is enslaved to us. And if you kill me, if your guy kills me, then our whole nation will be enslaved to you. We'll settle this like this, with just champions. And something we often overlook is that process of the armies lining up and Goliath stepping forward and proposing this challenge, that repeats itself for 40 days. For 40 days, they line up, and Goliath comes out and taunts them. And so what's happening back with the Israelites? No one's stepping forward, and stakes are sort of getting higher and higher. The tension is building over the course of these 40 days. So Saul, who is king at the time, is saying things like, okay, check it out. If you kill Goliath, then you get 100 acres of land. And all the Israelites are like, still don't want to go fight that guy. And then you get to marry my daughter and you'll be in the royal family. That sounds great, but I'll more likely be dead. And so they all are just sort of hanging back, terrified of these taunts from Goliath for a week. And then 2 weeks. And then 3 weeks. And then whatever 40 is divided by 7. And they end up in that sort of a space, terrified. Now, here's what's strange. Goliath, you'll know, his main feature, very tall man. And the leader of the Israelites happens to be known for his height as well. There's an obvious contender for who should be going out to fight Goliath. And it's King Saul. He stood head and shoulders above everyone else. He was the one who, if there's a physical matchup between Goliath and somebody from the Israelites, we have another physical contender, and it's Saul, and he's the king, the guy that we would follow into battle. But he stays paralyzed in fear at Goliath. And so his troops remain as he does, terrified. David, through a bit that we're skipping, ended up playing music in the court of King Saul. But for this time, while the army is at battle, David is on leave. And so he's back with his father in Bethlehem. And he's just doing the normal household chores. He's a shepherd again. And David's older brothers are enlisted in Saul's army, and so they're off at battle. So David's father, Jesse, tells David to take some supplies, basically a care package, bring it to your brothers so that they have food, and give it to their commander so that they might become in better standing, and then bring back a token from them and some news from the front lines. So David does. he takes it's like a bunch of cheese, which would be my dream if someone brought me a bunch of cheese. And they, that's news that is too glad to believe. And David arrives at the front lines, and he drops off the care package, and then he's standing and he's talking amongst people with his brothers, gathering news. And then in 1 Samuel 17, verse 23, it says, as he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. Remember, this has been repeating itself for 40 days now. And so it's routine, and he comes forward and he speaks these words, but this time there's a difference. And the turning point in our story begins with this tiny phrase at the end of verse 23, which says, and David heard him. A difference is coming for the nation of Israel. This time, David hears. Now, we're about to see these two paradigms work themselves over against each other. Paradigm of faith and the paradigm of power. And we'll see the paradigm of faith demonstrated in how David ends up fighting Goliath. The road to Goliath, at two occasions, David is confronted by the paradigm of power, which tells him, don't go and fight Goliath for all of these good and legitimate reasons. And David responds with this paradigm of faith, which overcomes these obstacles. So let's look at what David says when he finally hears Goliath, the champion, coming out and taunting Israel. And David said to the men who stood by him, this is verse 26, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Well, David opened his mouth again. Notice in his question, he doesn't necessarily volunteer yet. He doesn't say, like, I'll take care of this guy. This is on me. But for the first time in probably 39 days, someone in Israel's army describes the situation accurately. For the first time, someone sees through this dynamic of what's happening, and they see more than the spear that's the size of a weaver's beam. You all have weaver's beams at home. They see more than the sword between his shoulder blades. They see more than the 6'9" or 9 foot tall, depending on your translation, Goliath that's undefeated standing in front of them. Goliath, what David sees is Israel is the army of the living God. And there's a reason you don't challenge Israel. That's because God is alive. And he's made promises to this nation unlike any other nation, that he would see to it that they are victorious in their battle. And so for the first time in 39 days, David sees the factor that really matters. Not the size of Goliath's spear, not his own shortness, but that Israel is the army of the living God. Well, this is not well received by his older brother, who has been sitting there for 40 days, probably torn apart and wrestling in himself. Is it me? Will one of my other comrades go before me so that this Goliath will be taken down? Are we all going to battle today? He's been wrestling and tormented. And then David shows up delivering cheese and is like, you guys are just sitting here taking this? So Eliab responds how you would expect an older brother to respond to a precocious younger brother like David. He says, now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, which is classic. What have I done now? Like this was kind of a thing, a standard thing between him and Eliab. What have I done now? Was it not but a word? So look, the first attack from this paradigm of power, as we're calling it, comes from David's oldest brother. And the way that his brother responds, I think is really relatable. Like, look, this is a normal response. We'd even say like, yeah, that's probably about right, probably about what David deserved. You know, here's the thing, David, easy for you to say, man. You get to deliver the cheese, and you know what you do tomorrow? You go back home to the sheep. Oh, how dangerous. The wisdom from your life being on the line as well. Wow, David, come teach us the rest of your ways. Like, look, you can stand there on the outside looking in, and you can judge that we haven't gone in there yet, but until you're the one who's called to go fight Goliath, I don't want to hear any of this, David. And he calls it presumption. You know, you're stepping out of rank. You're too young for this. You're out of your element, Donnie. You're too young for this. So it's another way of saying, look, you'll get it when you're older. And what do we mean when we say that? We mean you'll get it when you actually have some skin in the game. That's the difference, right? Like, look, Megan and I, since we've had JT, we ski different. It's like, maybe not. And so we make all sorts of decisions differently. I think you sort of go through this phase where it's like, you know, now that we've got this other skin in the game and we're sort of established in this new place in our life, like, you know, I'm not gonna say what needs to be said because I gotta kind of politic and protect myself through this. And look, you young, naive idealist, you may look down on that, but look, you don't have any skin in the game. You got nothing to lose. What do we mean when we say that? We mean, look, there's actually a deeper reality to the world than that paradigm of faith. And I know what it actually takes to fight something like Goliath, because I know how battles really get won, and they get won by the person who is strongest. And that's the way the world works out here. So we sell ourselves out. And we say, you know, that paradigm of faith, it only really matters when you don't have anything at stake. But until then, that's not the real world. But David would not lose his naivety so quickly. Word goes around that there may be someone here who will go up against Goliath. And the word's not going around like, hey, the kid delivering the cheese is, kind of got a big head. Which shows that this army has gotten pretty desperate at this point. They're taking all applicants for who will go see Goliath. And so David finds himself speaking to King Saul as his name kind of made it through the ranks, probably despite Eliab's best efforts. And this is what David says to Saul. In chapter 17, verse 32 to 33, it says, "And David said to Saul, 'Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine.' And Saul said to David, in a gentler way than Eliab, 'You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth. And Goliath has been a man of war from his youth.' To which David said, 'Well, if I want to be like that, I better start today.'" He didn't say that. So again, we see him come across this paradigm of just, look, this normal good reasoning. Look at the power of Goliath. And we know what wins wars. You've got to be the more powerful one. There's one dominant rule in all of history: that power trumps weakness. We know that works. We'd have to undo all that we think of our physics to think that we'll send David and that he's got a shot against something like Goliath. But David has his reasons. And his reasons are where he describes his paradigm of faith, what his paradigm of faith really looks like. And so here's how David lays out his reasons. He talks a lot about him killing lions and bears, so I cut out the first part of it. So just think a lot of talking about killing lions and bears. And then he concludes with, "Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. For he has defied the armies of the living God." Why will he be victorious over Goliath? Because Goliath is the one who has defied the armies of the living God. And God is alive. You don't defy him to his face. He hasn't just set up the power structures of the world and then walked away for us to learn them and live in them. He is alive, still guiding his creation. So that means we need to live according to that. He continues on. David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." You know, to Saul's credit, he hears this, and I think for a moment, maybe of desperation, but at least for this moment, he really shifts. And he somehow sees this fresh paradigm from David of, you know what? We haven't been considering that we are the Lord's army. When David told Eliab treated David as though he called them all cowards. That's not what David said. He said, "You are the army of the living God." That's what was so offensive to them. They were offended because they were reminded of who they were really called to be. And then they look at their actions and it looks nothing like the armies of the living God. Now Saul hears this and he makes a shift. He says, you know, there is another factor here, and we haven't been living as though that other factor has been true. You know, it could be simple because he talks about the lions and bears for a long time. And it could be simple to say, here's why David thinks he can kill Goliath. It's because he actually has had this other battle experience. It's just been with lions and bears, and those are really formidable opponents. And so although we can't see it on paper, he really does have the resume in these other ways with the lions and the bears. But that's not the bottom of David's reasoning. The bottom of David's reasoning is, God delivered me from those lions and those bears. I have tasted and experienced the faithfulness of the Lord. When I experienced it, I didn't think, now I've worn it out. I thought, now I've come in contact with the unchanging God. And if he was faithful to me then, he will be faithful to me now. Just in the same way that he delivered and protected me from the lion and the bear, he will do the same against Goliath. And so Saul's mind changes. So now that he's made his way to Goliath, I think it's easy to consider that we've arrived at the moral of our story. You know, we don't operate in this paradigm of power, operate in the paradigm of faith. And what does faith look like? Faith looks like optimism against all odds. Oh, look at Goliath. He's this terrifying thing, but I'm not afraid of anything. I'm David, and I know that the living God is behind me no matter what. And so it looks like leap and the net will appear type of faith, this detached, cliche-ridden type of faith that doesn't inform the means that God will use to rescue, but instead just imagines this sort of like machine-like entering of our world that magically enacts some rescue. That's not what David is talking about. And we see that David's faith is different than that. It's not a detached faith. It's not a faith that says, look, God said it, and it may not look like it's lining up in any way right now. I'm just going to jump, and so here we go. I'm as good as anybody. That's not what we see. David's paradigm of faith is extremely grounded. And we're calling it a paradigm of faith because it's the way that he sees the whole world. It's what colors his assessment of the whole situation. It doesn't neglect the factor of God being alive. So we see the nuance of the paradigm of David's faith, the practicality of it demonstrated in the battle itself. So here's the setup. Saul offers David his own armor, and David tries it on, and he's like, it feels like I'm wearing my dad's armor. This isn't going to work. And so he takes it off, and he's like, okay, that feels better. I feel nice and light. And he goes and he gets 5 stones, and then he walks out to meet Goliath, and Goliath comes out, reiterates the same sort of speech, although he's really condescending to David. So he looks at David and he says, what am I, a dog that you've come out to me with sticks? Like you think you send out this little kid to fight me, Goliath? What paradigm is Goliath operating in? It's the paradigm of power. It works both ways. It paralyzes you in fear and it drives you forward in arrogance. In both cases, you're not assessing the situation accurately. There are factors that you're consciously ignoring because you're not considering, what if a more fundamental reality here is that God is alive? If Goliath had considered that, he never would have opened his mouth. Now, David walks out, and I'm going to read the whole thing because this is really cool. He calls his shot. David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. He even tells him how he's going to do it. I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. We can tell that David's faith is not this detached type of faith. And we can tell because David knows his strategy. David knows, I'm not going to come against you with a sword and a spear. Here's how it's going to go down. I'm going to strike you down. How he's going to do that is with a sling and a rock. And then I'm going to cut your head off. That's how you're going to die. And because of that, everyone's going to know that the Lord doesn't save by sword and spear. The Lord saves on his own means, by his own terms. That's how God saves. So here's how it goes. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. Done. He made quick work of the battle with the Philistine. And he moves forward and he takes Goliath's own sword, which would have looked kind of like a sickle, and he chops off Goliath's own head, like the statue, and he's holding up the head. So the thoughtful listener and the Malcolm Gladwell readers among you are thinking to yourself, isn't this really just another paradigm of power? Like, this is just the paradigm of the power of the technology of the sling over the technology of the sword. This is power demonstrated in lightness and agility rather than blunt force. Have we really learned anything? Have we really seen a paradigm of faith? Here's why we have. We expect a paradigm of faith to be completely detached from the means that God will use. We expect it to look nothing like the world that we live in, to be something that comes in totally out of left field, even indescribable. Instead, the paradigm of faith causes us to see the means that God would use in the world, not overlook the best ones. Here's what the paradigm of faith sounds like to David. I didn't ask to deliver the cheese, but here I am. And while I'm here, I see this Philistine denying the armies of the living God. I can't unhear that now. I've seen it. It's a part of my story. And he seems kind of like a staggering oaf, as like an old English writer would describe him. And he seems like a good way to take this guy down would probably be a sling. And look, I didn't ask to be a shepherd. I didn't ask for all that time alone in the woods to just be playing with my sling, but I've got it. So maybe God has put me here for exactly such a time as this. And maybe as inconsistent as it might seem from the outside looking in, as strange as it may be to my friends, as many obstacles as there will be in my path towards this faithfulness, perhaps exactly what God has called me to is that thing which he has perfectly equipped me for. And so David rests his faith on this idea that he is just a sling in God's hand. God never misses. And so I'm going to follow God down this path. Here's why I think many of us wouldn't do what David did. Because when we think paradigm of faith, we think, oh, I've got to step into something that just seems totally ridiculous and outlandish for me. We don't think, maybe I need to step into this thing right in front of me that God has really equipped me for, as strange as it may seem. So there's this practical paradigm of faith that David walks in. 1 Samuel 17, 50-51 says, So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran, stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, killed him, cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And you know what? The Israelites picked up on the fleeing, and they all joined in, and they chased off the Philistines, and they raided their camp. In this story, we see a picture of a deeper reality, this paradigm of faith, that maybe there is more to this world than our assessments of power. For that to become practical, you've got to consider all these ways in which you make those assessments of power. You know, in their normal ways. It's like, look, I'll finally be able to affect the change that I want once I get into that next position in my company. because it's only then that God will actually be able to use me. Rather than considering perhaps I'm tailor-made for where I am right now. And God is calling me to have that position colored by faith in him. That I'm here in a story that he is writing. And I don't need that type of power to accomplish the ends that he's looking to accomplish. I may need to be precisely where he's called me right now. So we see a story like David and Goliath where the mere mention of the name gives us the whole story. And it echoes through history because it points us. But it's pointing towards something. It's not just echoing, reverberating randomly in our subconscious. This is pointing to something. It's pointing to something that hundreds of other stories of faith in the Old Testament point towards. Something that the author of Hebrews will call something far better. Far better than David beating Goliath is an act of faith that we really need to see. You know, David beats Goliath, and he goes on to suffer in these terrible ways over the next couple of years as Saul's jealousy really mounts. I think that there will probably be lots of times where David is on the run, sitting in caves, thinking, man, I wish I never killed Goliath. This is a ripoff. I killed Goliath, and now I've become the object of attack from the very king I thought I was serving. And so he's running. Eventually, David will establish the kingdom, but the kingdom will crumble. And within one generation after David, it splits into two kingdoms, and there's a civil war. Generations after that, it's taken into exile, and then taken into exile again. And eventually, it just dissolves to be of no matter. And that's because there's a different obstacle here. And it's the obstacle that Eliab demonstrates, David's older brother, that Saul demonstrates. And it's when he's standing there on the battlefield and he sees Goliath ahead of him, and he knows that there is some call on him, some obedience required to go kill Goliath, and he knows that he can't. Be it he's not good enough with the sling, or be it he can't even muster the courage to go. There's a lot to be learned from looking at David and saying, go be like David. But here's the story of the Bible. You're Eliab. There's something in you that will break the whole nation eventually. There's something in you that will paralyze you in the ranks. Because, look, you believe the paradigm of power. When someone gives you advice in the paradigm of power, you call it practical. You know what you mean by that? This really works. This isn't like that other stuff. This really works. And because of that belief in the paradigm of power, we live lives where we just try and get it from other people, and we hoard it for ourselves, and we turn on each other, and we express nothing but evil in the world. And it never even crosses our mind that perhaps the fundamental reality of existence is something more like love than it is like power. Someone says that, it just sounds naive. And so, there's a bigger problem. There's a bigger problem than can be handled by killing Goliath. We need a far better rescue. And from the line of David, it comes. Where Jesus stands in front of a bunch of Eliabs like us. And he goes on and he takes on a Goliath that actually changes our hearts, the one we're actually fighting against in our hearts. That's our sin. And just like David, he doesn't kill that Goliath with a sword. Instead, he uses that Goliath's own sword against him. Because what we're fighting against is sin and death. And with the sword of sin, which is death, Jesus destroys death. He takes on our sin. And so what does Eliab do? Eliab stands back and he watches David walk out in front of him to represent him. And then when David was victorious, Eliab was victorious. And when Eliab saw David's victory, he picked up his own sword and he ran into the camp of the Philistines to share with David's victory. That's our position now. Be encouraged, be inspired, be motivated by the faith that you see in David. Hear the phrase David and Goliath and let it echo through your soul as it has done for generations. And let it put a battery in your back so that you move forward on things that otherwise you would have been paralyzed in front of. But then remember that it points to something far better. It points towards a representation of Jesus who destroys the real evil in your life, which isn't out there. It's not an enemy across a valley. It's in here. Who could possibly kill a Goliath like that? Who could possibly accomplish something that would transform the thing that's really stopping you, the sin that really causes the pain to those around you and to yourself? Only the Son of God, who would take the death that you deserve, that way you might be recreated in him. Look at his victory on the cross. While you were trembling and shaking behind him, giving nothing to advance it, he accomplished your victory. Now, looking at that, we pick up our swords and we run and we say, we're going to advance that kingdom. And we're going to live in a world that says the resurrection happened. And so that means the baseline assumption isn't I need to get power, but what if I lived in love? David points. Be inspired by him. But look at what he points to. Okay, with that, let's take one question. To what extent should we have faith in God? As much as you can. Should we ever take matters into our own hands? Referring to how David had faith in the Lord. Yeah, so this is the hard thing to explain that I don't think I've totally found the words yet to make this land. So let's try again. The way that we consider our faith as something that pulls us out. We think of our faith as like, here's the way we think of things. It's either God did it or I did it. And there's not really much compatibility between the two. But God doesn't seem to work like that. God uses means and he uses occasions. And the means and occasions that he uses look normal and typical even. They look like normal conversations with someone, and yet somehow God attends that normal conversation and boom, there's a spark in the other person's heart. And so there's this incredible transformation. And so what did you do there? You stood and you rocked back and forth and you thought, man, I don't know if I should ask this question. I don't know if I really want to go here. And then you did. You made yourself. You said, you know what? I'm just going to do it. And you asked the question. And that question inspired something in this other person's heart. The Spirit used that occasion to create a real change in someone. So did you take matters into your own hands? Or did you act in faith? Our faith isn't something that we tack on. It's like glasses that we put on, and it colors how we view everything. That's why you have to be converted. Because it's not, conversion means there's not an addition of something into your life. It means I thought this way, now I think this way. And these two things are incommensurable. So To what extent should we have faith in God? To the extent that reality exists because he spoke and therefore it exists. To the extent that what he says about our hearts and about the corruption that they now contain because of sin, to the extent that that's true. To the extent that the way he solved that was by the very sacrifice of his own son, who became a human like us with all our touchy-feely stuff and our weird faces and our conversations that we have, and then we leave and we think about them and how we would have said things differently. He became one of those. God, that God, became one of those and then died, which is something that he typically wouldn't do. And in that death, he paid for that terrible sin that he said was real in us. And in his resurrection, he joins us to himself by the outpouring of his Spirit, that we might be changed to see the world as it really is, the one he created. To the extent that he did those things, have faith in him. All right. We're about to take the Lord's Supper. Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." And he took the bread and he broke it and he said, "This is my body and it's broken for you." Then he took the cup and he said, "This is my blood and it's poured out for the new covenant." And what that new covenant means is Jesus accomplishes the victory while we stood back and did nothing. But because of faith in him, we can share in the victory that he accomplished. And it's a victory that works itself out first in our hearts and then in the whole world. And so when we come here as a church, this thing that he created, we share in the bread and the wine. We remember this new covenant that we stand in, and be inspired to take it with a faith that we see modeled in David. That perhaps the salvation Jesus described, which doesn't fit our paradigm of power at all, perhaps that's really true. I'm going to eat this and drink it in remembrance and hope of that. So let's do that together. Father, pray that you would join us in this time of communion. That as we take this as a body, you would knit us together as a body. Lord, how glorious your church is. How you took this army of cowards standing afraid, and you worked in our hearts to make us victorious. An army of champions with direct access to the living God. Father, give us faith that we might live and move like that. Lift this up in Jesus' name. Amen.